The foundational models are more focused on driving enterprise license volume. You have 50,000 person team rather than 100 legal licenses that are part of that company. The way that Harvey sort of curates things, sort of like a Michelin-star experience. There's a lot of hype around it. And for a certain type of audience, really want to get behind that curtain and see what that's all about. There's minimum seats, minimum spend, all that sort of stuff. And then you have us. I call it kind of your boutique neighborhood restaurant. It's a place where the owner and the chef will come out and remember your name, remember your kids' names. They're going to take requests from their customers and really deliver that really great neighborhood family experience. Most of our customers are looking for that magic button.
But we're getting dangerously close to Claude letting the users press that magic button without knowing how to code, without having any specific professional knowledge. Don't you think that is a big threat to tech companies out there?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Anthropic just moved into legal. So what happens to all the other startups building in this space? Today, I'm speaking to Bryan Lee, CEO and co-founder of Ruli, a legal intelligence platform for in-house legal teams, about exactly that. Bryan and his co-founders come from a big tech and big law background. And in our conversation, I asked him how he translates that experience into what he's building and what his read on the legal tech market is now and in the future. Let's get started.
Bryan, so happy to have you with us today from Texas.
Yeah, Anna, thanks for having me. I moved here actually, a few years ago from the Bay Area.
So why did you choose to move to Texas and build Ruli out of Texas? Because my understanding is that a lot of these legal tech companies from the US are either based in San Francisco or New York, but you chose Texas.
Yeah, I think for me, it was, a bit of a personal decision to move to Austin first. And the legal tech came after both my co-founder and I left Meta Reality Labs building AR glasses. And my co-founder is actually based in San Francisco. I think you get a better perspective when you have sort of remote first team. And we have some folks in like Colorado, for example. And because the Bay Area, it tends to kind of be subject to groupthink, which can be like, accelerator, but can also be a limiter in a lot of ways. And so I think it's great to kind of get that different perspective. You go to different parts of like, Austin, or even, as we, get into other areas like Nashville, Atlanta, there are people who've never heard of Harvey.
Tell me a little bit more about the founding team of Ruli and how you work together and what kind of dynamics you have as a founding team.
So my background is in, computer engineering and law, did big law in-house, and then, found out that, I'm really more of a product guy ultimately, and built a lot of products from the first Google Assistant, working on that to like early LLM and transformer technology at Google, and then later. And then my co-founder's experience, he's been, he holds a number of machine learning patents, and he's been building, machine learning, the precursor to AI, at Amazon, a decade ago, and then has that experience through places like LinkedIn, Airbnb, and also Facebook. We have a GC on the team.
So Ruli today serves a lot of smaller legal in-house teams. And from our conversation thus far, you mentioned that the core founding team all have big law, big tech backgrounds. So what makes you think that you would understand the problems and the challenges of the smaller legal teams, given the core founding team all came from these big companies and big law firms?
Yeah, I guess that's a great question. I think like what we found is, our focus is sort of mid-market at the moment. I think like we also have like larger enterprises in our pipeline, which is great. And I think they've seen some of our early successes and have come knocking down our door, but what's also surprised me is actually, the legal teams are actually quite lean. And so we have a sole GC that's also part of our customer base at Worksport, but he's sole GC of a public company that's listed on NASDAQ. And that's something new that I think that I maybe had not realized before coming into legal AI, that actually, companies can be quite substantial, but legal teams are still quite lean, right? Not every legal team is going to be at that sort of big tech level, but actually a lot of them are in this sort of 2 to 25 mix. And, we call it mid-market, but actually a lot of the companies are I guess punch in a higher weight class than you'd expect.
And so to maybe help educate me and also other folks who are trying to understand, what are the different needs of these teams? If you cannot segment by the size of the company, because even like you said, NASDAQ listed companies can have very small and lean legal teams, whereas, a mid-sized company could have potentially a bigger legal team. Like, how would you bucket the different needs of these legal teams if it's not by, how big the company is?
Ultimately, I think there's similar problem sets that I think legal teams of all sizes share that we've grounded on. One is like, how do we, move at the speed that the business moves, right? I think that's pretty universal, right? And that could be more efficient. It could be looking at things that are more self-service for the business. Two is like, there's this need to maybe reduce outside counsel spend. And I think, if you're a smaller team, it's almost like, there is no outside counsel budget potentially. And I think when you look at the very large teams, sometimes it's like, wow, our outside counsel budget is, tens and $50 million or whatnot.
Especially if you work for a bank company.
Exactly. And the legal AI products might only be like the cost of one headcount. And so it's, the economics are really strong. And I think that, I think there's also this third area that we hear a lot, which is, everyone's sort of dissatisfied with their CLM.
It is very confusing for a lot of legal teams as they're also trying to navigate what kind of problems they tackle. And I'm sure it is for the founders as well, because there's so many different directions you can go in terms of building your product. And from my understanding, for a legal intelligence platform category product, obviously everybody from day zero started out with a chatbot and then expanded beyond that. And then we had the integrations into Word, and those gradually all became table stakes. And then to make a different direction call on which point you go to. And one is I go to build a CLM. Another direction is I become the legal front door. I help build out the business self-service route. So how did you grapple with these different directions and which direction to focus on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think one thing that we actually want to call out is we didn't start with a chatbot. So what's interesting is I think the majority of folks did. And I think for us, in summer 24, when we initially started, we actually started with an agentic vision, but the market wasn't really ready for it. So originally we were building a kind of like a reinvented, you call it legal front door, but with a digital paralegal that you could really orchestrate and work directly with you, but also for the business and sort of do that triaging self-service, but also automated review. But I think at the time, what we found, and also it was grounded in your institutional knowledge. And what was interesting at the time was legal teams were just asking for a legal co-pilot. And so they're like, we love the idea of you grounding our institutional knowledge. We don't see that with other players out there. So how can you add all our context of our company and give me this sort of custom legal AI assistant? But I just want it to talk to me. Right. Because there's this comfort level of like, and you didn't, the word agent wasn't even out there yet. Right. So we were calling it digital paralegal because the word agents wasn't even in the vocabulary yet. So then we actually built more towards this co-pilot vision, but always with a platform in mind, because we thought this sort of, you can call it Claude legal moment was inevitable. And I think like I wrote posts about this recently where you have to understand, are you building in the jet stream or not? And what I mean by that analogy is like the core foundational models are sort of like, these fighter jets are like launching this jet stream and you don't want to be caught in that jet stream where you're going to be eviscerated. And I think like, one of those examples is like, some of the coding tools, since they've building that direction to really take on coding as one of the higher use cases. If you're simply coding agent, you're going to be in that jet stream. It's okay to be in there, but you have to recognize that you are. And then for us, what we realized was, if you're just building sort of a legal AI, more of a chat wrapper, eventually you're going to be eviscerated in that jet stream. And so we've always been having this platform vision. And I think what's exciting for us is, we build an area where we have legal assistant that focuses on research. We do contract intelligence, but a way that focuses on post-signature intelligence. So we're very deliberate of not necessarily swimming in that CLM lane, even though we've had some asks about it, and not doing that pre-signature workflow work. Maybe someday that could be true, but for now we've delineated to be more of this, continuous legal intelligence and giving you sort of like agentic insights along the way. And then we're of course we're in the word plugin as well, and we're stitching that vision together. That allows us to serve not only commercial counsels but product counsel. I think a lot of customers, what they love about us is that we're able to serve all members of the legal team in a way where they're able to buy one platform, grow with it, and have different members of the team really benefit from some part of Ruli.
Yeah, so I think that's super interesting that instead of like building deeper into the like niche of contract automation, which then you would, try to build out a CLM, a workflow management tool for, the contract lifecycle process. You decided to move horizontally and try to also build out solutions for different types in-house counsel within like a company. So like product counsel is one of them. It would be really interesting for me to hear an example of how Ruli serves and helps, let's say, product counsel or employment counsel in a way that maybe some of the other platforms don't do at the moment.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think like for us, what you're able to do is because you're able to bring your cloud drives in and search that information that you have in the past. We have people that will use it to help draft new policies, for example. Like there's product counsel needs to draft new policies, as well as things like looking at terms of service, but while incorporating that with their legal research needs. The same thing we're seeing with employment as well, or more regulatory lawyers looking at the regulatory or employment requirements across. One of our customers is Sequoia, that does HR benefits, and they do exactly that. That's the nature of their business, and they use a lot of our product to stay ahead of regulations, compliance in the employment space. So they're able to actually bring that into their core product offering themselves, but then as well as having the benefit of the platform to really also serve commercial needs as well. And I think where I was going with my earlier point was, I think what's exciting for today is I think we're moving back to that agentic sort of vision potentially, because I think what we're seeing now from a lot of customers is I think they're very comfortable with this Copilot platform experience, and we're in that phase next where there's a lot of lawyers asking for how do we automate workflows and build agents, and you're seeing that curiosity now. And I think we're at that phase where we can start realizing what has been our long-term vision of sort of moving in this orchestra analogy, the violinist to be sort of the conductor, which is also like, kind of the long-term vision really is having, the different agents being the different people playing the instruments, and eventually moving the lawyer in the individual seat to that conductor seat.
So you mentioned earlier about meeting the users where they are, which is back in 2024. The users might not be ready at that time for agentic workflows. But do you think it could also be the case that even if the founders had the vision for agentic capabilities and workflows, the tech just wasn't there yet? Because I know at that time, even like with chat queries, there were a lot of hallucinations. I remember attending a conference even in 2025 where someone in a panel would make a joke that ChatGPT would get the time wrong when he asked the time. So like you don't see those kind of mistakes as frequently anymore, or like, they can't spell strawberry correctly. So do you think that is the combination of, the users not feeling comfortable with that idea, and also in addition to that, like the model capabilities just wasn't there to realize that vision at the time?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's definitely part of it. I think the more recent deep reasoning models that were released that we've also incorporated in our product in the last few months takes us to a higher level of confidence that we didn't see in sort of that 24 period. Definitely think it's a combination of sort of like user trust and adoption where the technology was. But what's interesting is, we do have early customers using this module of ours, which is this agentic product that I discussed, that we have it sort of like a secret menu. I guess if you're at In-N-Out in the US, you can order a secret menu that's hidden if you know kind of like the right way to order it. And we actually offer that to our customers. And a bit of the irony is it's our first product, you think of it as sort of a legacy product, but ironically, it's now coming back as in vogue, sort of as like the add-on, the special secret menu add-on where people want basically FAQ answering in Slack, or some sort of automated review, which we do for some of our early customers directly for the business for compliance review. And I think that's something that we're really thinking hard about on how we might redevelop that in the second half of the year with some more of the deep reasoning models that have been recently released.
Tell me more about this secret menu of automated review. Can you give me a concrete example how some of the legal teams are using that function?
Yeah, I think it's largely in two parts. So for a public company that we've been working with for a year now, and they've decided to renew with us this month, which is fantastic. we basically take one of their compliance workflows where there's documentation submitted in from the business. They're in the real estate business, and we take a sort of like a rules derivative of like the Fair Housing Act policy with kind of how they interpret it, of where they think, high risk issues are, where they would auto approve it, where things would be escalated onwards for some human level review. And then effectively we auto approve it directly for the business. In other cases, it's pending. And then the legal goes in to sort of make any adjustments that they like and review it. But that's happening. We probably had processed over like 20,000 requests at this point over the course of a year. And I think that things like that are very interesting. I think you could apply certain things to maybe NDAs or marketing compliance review, which are interesting use cases that are high volume, low risk, especially in terms of like, for the NDAs in terms of like actual, practical enforcement. And I think a lot of those things are interesting to explore. And I think, other ways as well is really the FAQ answering, in Slack, policy answering, and having a trusted agent doing that sort of work that we can program it, give it guardrails, have it point to certain policies. And that's something that we do as part of our secret menu product. And we're thinking deeply about the evolution of that, because we think the market is, finally getting there in terms of like understanding how you kind of program agents and orchestrate. And I think that's a really exciting future. At the moment, I think like we're kind of learning, we've learned a lot, and I think we want to kind of bring it to prime time later in the year and kind of bring that, kind of lift the curtain off of the secret menu. But it's been exciting to kind of explore that with some of our early customers who really, I think we're early on what agents were and orchestration was before those became coined terms in the industry.
Yeah. So speaking about legal research, because you mentioned it quite a bit earlier, and I've been trying it. It's something that not a lot legal intelligence platforms currently offer or do it very well. And I know that Ruli has indexed the primary sources for regulations within the US, but I don't see any case law. And so I wonder, what is the product decision around that? And maybe talk me through the challenges building out a really good legal research function. Because if it was easy, I'm sure a lot of the other platforms would have already done it.
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. I think it was possibly this is grounded in my own sort of lawyering experience. I was never loved Westlaw or Lexis, and I was never a litigator. Originally, I was a securities lawyer and then later a commercial lawyer in-house. So case law has never been my forte. And I think for us, what we realized early on was when we interviewed a lot of in-house attorneys, and in my own experience, case law was not an area of focus for in-house teams. They're at a point where they're focused more on the regulation, what the laws are. They reference law firm memos for certain interpretation of, call it landmark cases. But for litigation in particular, and we don't steer in that e-discovery space for litigators, that might be a subset of very large legal teams. I think that's a very different workflow. And for the majority of sort of mid-market, like it's rare that you have like a dedicated litigator on team. And if they do, that's not an area that we serve. And so we made that deliberate choice, and it allowed us to focus, right? And then we can also build our tech stack around the institutional knowledge, which is already a ton of information to get your hands around at the company, and optimize on that to give you basically the ability to search your knowledge or just have it as context for the assistant. So it'll know all your board document information if that's what you've kind of pointed at, and then you're drafting new board materials that kind of use the basis of that information in the past, for example. And I think one of the challenges with case law that I think for the non-lawyers that may be listening is like you really have to look at sort of the Shepherd's Index or whatnot. It's not just about what the case law says, right? You have to look at the hierarchy, the rankings, et cetera. And, when I was an attorney, I looked more at the editorial content, which, Lexis and Westlaw has written decades on. And I think that's why people are surprised when they realize Harvey actually licenses the LexisNexis database. So they have all this capital, but they themselves don't, do that case law depth on their own. And I think, that if you're building in that space, it's certainly an area where you not only have to build going forward, but you have to figure out how do I, get all the precedent right on all the past, right? Which is very, very different. And then I think when you look at the technical side of that, even if we did all that, because there might be a minority of customers that like that, that's too much information for AI. So I think about that, that RAG structure of how people look at, how information retrieval works in LLMs. And my analogy is AI is far more accurate when you're shooting fish in a barrel. And that's why the way that we do it, we curate now primary legal sources for US, but we also recently had a UK and EU. And then we also do a curated web layer where you're not going to get things from like Reddit and things like that. So it's very different from like a Google search. We have certain priorities on certain .gov, certain EDU sites, like things like Harvard, Cornell Law, et cetera, but also the AM Law 250 law firm memos sort of that get published. And with that, you get a far more curated experience. And my analogy for it is effectively shooting fish in a barrel. And that gives you more accuracy, less hallucinations, more of the things you're looking for, rather than if I just tried to get everything in there, including case law, et cetera, and then there'd just be too much noise.
So I really like that analogy, shooting fish in a barrel. I'm definitely going to use it somewhere else. Before we move on from legal research, you mentioned this curated web layer. And I'm sure some people who are Claude and, Manus enthusiasts are going to say, well, you know what? You can do that with Claude as well. I can just create a skill to say, only search for primary sources or law firm articles, and then pair that with an NAN workflow that automates and then sends me updates, the kind of areas of law I'm interested in, and send that to my inbox on a weekly basis. What do you say to that? So I think like two questions, just so it's fair. For what kind of users would that actually make more sense for them? And then for which group of users it would make more sense to choose a platform like Ruli for this kind of task?
It's a great question. I think like with, Claude's, Word plugin and the way you can DIY and build skills, I think there's, it's really coming down to kind of like a DIY versus, buy an enterprise SaaS product type of experience. And I think that's, a place to keep in mind and to really, think about that. Because I think there are a lot of things that are beyond sort of the product itself, which, as a purchaser or a consumer, like you're buying into things like, customer success. You're buying into things like the depth of the quality of like the UX features, and how deep can they go, right? Ultimately, the foundational models are more focused on, driving just enterprise license volume, right? And a lot of that volume comes from you have a 50,000 person team, maybe 25,000 could be engineers like in a tech company. That's really their focus rather than the 100 legal licenses that are part of that company. They're using that more of a differentiator so they can beat maybe ChatGPT or other foundational models and really win that whole package, right? And I think there's a level of focus that they won't have necessarily going in that depth. And I think if you're a customer of, say, like let's say you're a legal customer and you're trying to get, your priority built of like what your feature requests are, it's highly unlikely that with these foundational models that you're going to have a customer success person that you can even talk to, depending on how large your team is, or if you're just, having a subscription model and there's only a couple of you on team, highly unlikely. And then two, like where's that priority stack? They're probably going to build for the coding agent more likely first, or, the largest voice within that ecosystem. So I think all that gives you a very different level of depth and experience, but it's up to you to decide what's that level of depth that's appropriate for your business and for your needs. I have a great analogy for this. I think, to kind of put things in perspective, I think, so we use like a sort of like a food analogy, restaurant analogy. So I think, the way that Harvey sort of curates things, sort of like a Michelin-star experience. There's a lot of hype around it. And for a certain type of audience, it's like, oh, I really want to get behind that curtain and see what that's all about. And then there's, big velvet rope. You got to like book your seat, 3 months in advance, put a deposit, there's a lot of restrictions, there's minimum seats, minimum spend, all that sort of stuff. Right. And then I think you have your foundational model through your, Claude, et cetera. That's sort of like your McDonald's. I think it's like mass mainstream. It's like, hey, you have your menu options. It's very quick serve, but like, you're not going to get, any real sort of depth and customer experience, or you're not going to be able to, affect change or like get your sort of products, your product requests sort of met necessarily and influence that roadmap. And it's really about scale and speed. And then I think you have, us and maybe some others in this, I call it kind of your boutique neighborhood restaurant, right? It's a place where, you can reliably know that they're going to be there, as part of the community. the owner and the chef will come out and remember your name, remember your kids' names, right? They're going to shape the menu in a way that could be seasonal, and they're going to take requests from their customers and really kind of deliver that really great sort of like neighborhood boutique family experience. And I think ultimately it depends what you're looking for. And you could potentially start with sort of that, mass McDonald's experience. Maybe you tried that, you're curious, and you see a lot of customers curious, hey, I want to see what Harvey's about. And then some of that flashes, leads to maybe some disappointment on expectations. But I think there's, value to kind of what we are offering for the right audience, where there's this boutique experience where a lot of our customers say, we win because of our customer success, sort of boutique white glove experience that we deliver, not only at the, that we start at that pilot stage, that we bring all throughout the entire customer journey with us.
Yeah, I thought your comment on LinkedIn for my Claude review post was really amazing, painting that bigger context of, Anthropic's broader strategy of, let's say, why they would launch, for example, a word plugin. But this analogy with the different restaurants, I think, is even better. It's hard to top that game. But you do wonder, though, like some people could say that maybe in the future, you don't need to have that custom white glove service because the foundational models, even if it's quick serve, even if you can never, have your own personal customer service account executive, the models and the skills and the whole plugins will be so powerful that you can just DIY and create whatever kind of experience you need. And that will be enough for most users. Do you see a future where that could be possible?
And everybody wants to do DIY because for a couple of reasons, I think like ultimately most folks, don't really are not going to dive into that DIY necessarily. Most of our customers are looking for that magic button. They don't even necessarily want to prompt that question. I think like where it is important though is to think about differentiation in your product, because I think what's clear is if you are only sort of doing chat necessarily, and it's a very surface level chat, like maybe there isn't deep legal database resources or some sort of curation that gets very vertical, or if you're only doing very surface level word plugin and you're not going into that depth of like surgical red line or tying intelligence back to like everything that the customers agreed before in like a sort of intelligent repository, et cetera, then yes, I think that gets eroded. I do think that gets eroded, right? But, are they going to build, e-discovery tools and all those other things? I think it's a harder stretch to think that everyone's going to DIY everything based on a foundational tool.
So you say that not everyone will want to DIY. They will just want to press a magic button. But we're getting dangerously close to Claude Code and Claude Cowork, letting the users press that magic button without knowing how to code, without having any specific professional knowledge base to create those DIY solutions that seemingly meet their needs. So don't you think that is a potential big threat to a lot of legal tech companies out there?
I think, something to think about is, I think there's a distinction of moving legal folks from sort of the hot seat to more orchestration, but the distinction being, how many of those folks want to move into that product builder space? And I think when you look at that broad market, I think it's, I think the early adopters and being in that early adopter side, you have more folks wanting to DIY in that experimentation. But when you start talking to folks in the broader landscape, like maybe being Texas and having a different purview, I guess the majority of the way that we're seeing sort of that purchase cycle and that intent is more folks are like, hey, we want to trust you that with Ruli and their expertise on the tech side and legal side, that you've kind of curated the best experience for me. So I think there's this idea of curation that's always been in sort of the human evolution that people really like. And so I think ultimately there'll be people that will be looking for some sort of curation, for some sort of expert, whether that is from us or maybe it is from a DIY curator expert on their team. But ultimately, I think there's somebody there where that curation is part of their DNA, and other folks are like, I think I want to trust someone else to do that curation for this particular domain versus, other specialties.
Yeah. So, moving on from the foundation models, you mentioned this curation process as being very important for a lot of legal teams. So, what would be your advice for legal teams that are exploring different legal tech options, and each option, like each vendor, tells them that they can offer a curated experience for them? What do you think are some of the good proxy metrics that legal teams should be looking out for when they're evaluating whether a vendor is a good fit for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, I think often, what we've seen is legal teams just kind of making a list of, maybe like, legal AI vendors and plus CLMs in that mix, and just creating a mix of all sorts of different things that do different things, so different categories. I think, you want to start foundationally on like looking inside and figuring out like what is it that we want to solve. Maybe going back to those earlier buckets, is it some sort of efficiency for the business? What areas, as a business do we focus on? Do we do more contracts? Are we in a regulated industry? What are those things that we do, right? As an in-house team. I think, more teams should just start there. I think when you gravitate towards, your pilot experience, we always offer up to customers where we want to help them identify the 2 or 3 things that they really want to get out of the product, or like meaning like what they want to solve as use cases, rather than necessarily try and just test everything under the sun. Because I don't think that really gets you that true ROI. And I think like the third point, which should be more obvious, is like, which I think is not, is like figuring out which vendor is able to sort of prioritize your voice. And I think one of those obvious things is like maybe using, Harvey as an example. If you're an in-house team, like I think, I would think hard about using Harvey necessarily, because if you're looking to influence their roadmap, because they're 90% focused on big law firms and that big law experience. Most of their features that they're launching are for that. And so if you have specific things where you want them to build Slack integrations or things like that, it's likely going to be missed on that, on that roadmap based on priorities. So I think like, focusing on an in-house team or an in-house focused vendor that is more aligned to also maybe the, kind of like that, that stage of your company, and being able to really prioritize the things that are important for you. I think it is something that is really important that I think often gets missed.
So I think vendors are also partly to blame for this because, first of all, they're not always very clear on exactly which customer segment they're serving, because they might be also exploring themselves, or they want to widen the net, let's say, and capture more leads. Yeah. And second of all, vendors all will say that they will bring a curated experience and that they tailor to the customer's needs. And let's say if the customer actually did the homework, the legal teams did the homework and say, we only have these 2 use cases. What I've been hearing from the legal teams is that vendors are always trying to upsell and sell them something that they didn't initially ask for. So if you came for a legal research function, I'm going to try and sell you a contract automation function and a CLM function as well. So do you agree with that also being the case?
Certainly there's, I think vendors, trying to stretch in all sorts of directions. I think that's definitely a culprit. I think what's unique about us is we try to be really honest, honestly, and we've identified early on sometimes that like, hey, it looks like you're looking for more of a CLM with those pre-signature workflows, or something from DocuSign or something like that, and we actually just make that recommendation up front. We don't try to like force a square peg in a round hole sort of thing. And so that's something maybe that is refreshing from folks that chat with us, relative to other vendors.
For less transparent vendors out there, what do you think is a tactic or a question or way for legal teams to be able to find out whether that vendor is actually a good fit for their core use cases? Because their sales teams are always very slick and they always try to capture every lead. So if you were in their shoes, what questions would you ask, or what would you do to really find that good fit? If the other side isn't as transparent as Ruli is.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one, I think use resources like yours, Anna, at Legal Benchmarks. I think that's one great resource. I think looking at some of the customer success stories is another sort of proxy. But really, I think getting your hands on the product, but doing that homework in advance, where you isolate out sort of those 2 or 3 things and get that buy-in from the rest of your team to figure out what are those 2 or 3 things that you really want to drill in on. And I think, you can even ask for more of a, even if you don't have the time to go into that, that trial or that pilot experience, asking for a more specific tailored demo on those specific use cases is maybe a good approach initially before even diving deeper with those teams.
Hmm. So speaking about transparency, I'm going to say that again because that is botched. Speaking of transparency, I want to ask about the pricing for Ruli because I've heard from my previous conversations from Preston, which is the CEO of Simple Ducks, that most VC-backed companies deliberately hide the pricing for their products because there's pressure from the VCs and also this understanding that if you hide the pricing, then you can jack up the prices potentially later on. So what is decision behind Ruli, despite being venture-backed, listing out the pricing transparently, and have you faced any pressure from VCs for you not to do that?
You have to have the right VCs that sort of are in your corner. We haven't had that pressure. Our VCs, trust us and have us, lead the way. We think it's important to build trust and give certainty. So I don't think we've actually changed our pricing in 9 months. Looking back, and we have that. We want to give that certainty to our customers and be transparent. And of course, like we also do volume discounts over 5 users and tier that. And so I think like it's important. I think it's surprising, and we've learned about these pricing games from some of our competitors, and they've benefited to our advantage because I think it's created this confusion in the market where they started with a particular vendor. They were at a certain price. They started to look at us. And then when they went back to that vendor, the price changed or whatnot. And for us, offering that stability, I think has been very welcome.
So switching gears a bit, if you were to build Ruli from scratch today, what would you do differently?
Originally, because of our big tech background, we talked to a lot of lawyers in tech who in Silicon Valley, and I think they're in that early adopter train. And so that using that as a proxy early on meant that we built even ahead of like where the general market was. So I think actually talking to more customers again, like outside of Silicon Valley, in, the Midwest, in like the South, other markets, right, is important to kind of get that pulse, especially in the legal market where I think that greater S curve is actually not, the behavior is a little bit different from where that early adopter train is, which also tends to be a little bit more, DIY and advanced on, where AI in general is going.
How do you think a lawyer's work will be different in, let's say, 20 years' time in 2041?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think just starting with what we've seen from last summer to now, just a little under a year. I think one thing that's unique, that unique insight that we've seen is a lot of our customers and other pilot trials. We had people, we had lawyers kind of going into the software and trying to run the hardest tests and try to like, show me everything you can do, kind of like a really hardcore, test drive in a way that's not, practical how they use it day to day. But now we've actually seen a shift where of late, we've had the same sort of customers and new sort of pilot users ask us like, can we curate so there's a little bit less red lines and just make it more practical? We're not looking for something exhaustive, but looking for something that's practical of like, what do I actually need to do? Because like what is more realistic to actually redline with the other side, or what are the real takeaways from, some of the legal research? So we've made those adjustments more recently to actually like dial back some of the AI results, which was very interesting because originally people wanted almost to test that AI could catch everything. But now they're like, okay, now I almost have that trust and adoption curve that's basically happened in the last 9 months. And we've seen that user behavior shift to now, okay, I kind of trust AI. Just show me practically what I have to do. So I think that like we've seen that already happen in a very compressed timeline in these 9 months. So I think then the question is going out to 2041, that's a lot of time, right? If you've seen like based on what's happening in these 9 months, I think then you absolutely get to this environment where, in our vision of, the violinist moving to being the orchestra conductor, I think there will be different models of how you work within the company, within the different teams as well. I think you're going to see something that we sort of coin like agent to agent workflows. And I think it'll be something where, whatever is the new CRM of the future, probably will just talk to the legal agent directly. And then only if there's something that requires a human involvement are you going to get involved. But it's likely, the coding agent's just going to get, the legal agent involved to look at things around, product counsel issues directly. And then, the product counsel will get a report on it, and everyone kind of moves into this more orchestration layer.
Yeah. So pull us back into the present moment and reality, and to wrap up for real this time, this conversation with 2 quick fire questions. What's your current tech stack in terms of like the tools that would be that have been a game changer for you? And what resources that you think are something so amazing that people should all check out to stay current on AI?
Yeah, great questions. So for us, we're pretty, we like to keep it pretty light, but we have gravitated towards as a team, either Claude or Gemini. Part of it is a lot of it's for coding for our engineering team, but even our designer has become a vibe coder to kind of bridge the gap between designs and the front UI level, which is very cool. I use Claude a lot for a mix of thought partner as you're developing products. It's actually really great, sort of like quick UX testing on certain things that I have like theses in mind, but also I like to use it to kind of mock up things really quickly, have a productive conversation with my designer and engineering team. A couple of resources for folks to check out is I'm a big listener of like Lenny's podcast, which focuses on a lot of like, product and tech interviews on kind of like, emerging, but also very practical, takeaways from a lot of it, in AI and tech. But also like to listen to, Steve Eisman, who is one of those guys who's a big hedge fund investor from like the Big Short. So one of those guys who shorted, the market with financial crisis and got that right. But he does, he's got a podcast out that really talks about the macro investment picture. I think that's really important to understand where the money is funneling into sort of AI or not, and how it's impacting SaaS companies. And I kind of like to look at that for like the macro picture.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bryan, for sharing your thoughts and the resources and the tools you use. That's a wrap for today. And hopefully we'll see more of Ruli in the upcoming years.
Thank you, Anna, for featuring us. It's been a blast and just an invigorating conversation. Thank you.
Oh, wow. I got that on the record.
If you like this episode, check out the other LIP deep dives on the Legal Benchmarks channel and subscribe.